Thank you, Bruce, for having me here. I'm a professor in the Department of Medicine in the Division of Neurology at the University of British Columbia. But much of what I have to say is not necessarily um, in agreement with many of my colleagues at UBC. So the opinions that I express are my own, not representative of UBC. I'm also the president of Connexus Bioinformatics, a company that's been in business for about 22 years. Providing services to about 2,000 labs around the world, both academic and industrial. And I'm also the chair of the Scientific and Medical Advisory Committee for the Canadian COVID Care Alliance. So my research actually in the last year and a half has involved studying SARS-CoV-2, primarily trying to develop better tests for determining if a person have antibodies against the virus, and that would be an indicator that they've been infected and probably have more natural immunity. And also I've been involved in looking at drugs that can interfere with the replication of the SARS-CoV-2 virus in cells. And we've actually come up with some really interesting inhibitors that are very potent at blocking the replication of the virus. Perhaps these might be used in the future to help fight the virus. So that's sort of in a nutshell what I do.
And when did you first like encounter the COVID-19? Like, what can you remember back? I mean, I know it's a while ago. It's 18 months, but what was your first, sense of what was on the horizon?
Yes, well, we had SARS-CoV-1 about a little over 17 years ago. And actually, I had a colleague of mine at that time who was using spot peptide synthesis. It's a method by which you can make portions of proteins as individual spots on arrays, on membranes. And he had actually done some experiments where he took the SARS-CoV-1 virus genome, as it was known at that time, and spotted it out and took serum from people who have had COVID in that case from, I guess you would call it today, COVID 2003 or something. Anyways, he found that there was actually immunoreactivities are very distinct, that some portions of the virus proteins gave very strong antibody reactivities and other ones gave none. So when the genome of the SARS-CoV-2 virus became available towards the end of January, we thought, well, why don't we take those parts of the SARS-CoV-1 virus that were immunogenic and make the same corresponding portions of SARS-CoV-2, and let's see if we can see immunoreactivities there that are similar to what was seen in SARS-CoV-1. And we
Are,
did
are,
that initially.
are there quite a few commonalities between the two SARS?
There, depending on what parts of the proteins you're looking at, it can be as high as 85% amino acid identity, but it depends on which portions. So we were very interested in the parts that were a little bit more distinct. I guess our thoughts were that if we saw a nice response against SARS-CoV-1, we might see a really nice response against SARS-CoV-2, because we thought in the processing of those proteins by immune cells that if they were immunogenic for one, maybe they'd be immunogenic for the other. So we did that, and then we decided to get ambitious. We got positive results, we saw spots, and then we thought, well, let's just do the whole proteome. Let's just say all 28 proteins in the virus, have it created in pieces that are 15 amino acids long, because as you know, a protein is just a long beaded chain of amino acids. And for example, the spike protein has over almost 3,000 or so of these. So we basically re-synthesized all of the proteins encoded by the genome of that virus in individual pieces that they overlapped. So each piece would have, for the adjacent spot, would be about 13 out of the 15 amino acids would be identical. So that allows us to zoom in on differences of 2 amino acids that could define a epitope that an antibody would bind to. And so when we did this, 8,000 fragments, we found that there was several hundred parts that people made antibodies against when we used serum from people who had recovered from COVID-19. And so they, in order to recover, they would have to have antibodies that actually are protective and work. So when we did this, we found several hundred markers. So then the challenge was to find the best markers that were the most common in as many people as possible that had COVID, because it turned out that the patterns of which parts an individual would have would vary from person to person. So we wanted to find the parts that were the most consistently immunoreactive, and we got it to 110, and then we got it down to about 41 markers, is just what we use now. So 10 of the different proteins in the virus are tracked with 41 markers, and then an extra marker that determines that a person has IgG, so that we know as a positive control that everything else in the experiment was going properly for detection. So that's what we've been doing. We've probably done, using this 41 marker test now, pretty close to, I would say, at least 1,500 people. But with the additional tests we did with larger screens earlier, we probably did about another 700 people. So we've done well over 2,000 people to date that we've tracked.
And the membrane technology, that's a recent invention of yours. Like it's a recent application. Is that not correct? Like you also you would do it straight from blood, but you can also from this blood drop test. Is that correct?
That's correct. We were originally starting with a bit more blood, but now in reality, all we actually need is one blood drop. And we could even do the 300 marker test with one blood drop if we wanted to. And that's sort of where the technology has been going. You know, in the interim, we also made antibodies against SARS-CoV-2 virus proteins, because our company, it's actually specializes in making antibodies, which we've done for the last 22 years. So we make antibodies against cancer proteins and neurological disease-related proteins. So for us, we've made over 1,600 different antibodies. So we're very attuned to how to make antibodies. And also to do that, you know, we make these synthetic peptides that represent portions of those cancer proteins. So all we did is the same thing. We just made portions of the SARS-CoV-2 proteins, but instead of going and getting blood from rabbits that have been injected with those peptides, we just take the blood from people who have been infected with the virus, and then look at how they bind to these peptides that we know are very specific. So that's how it works. But the technology itself is actually it's been around for at least a decade and a half, but very few companies around the world actually have that technology in place and are working with it.
So how would this differ from other?
Nobody.
How would this differ from, like, say, for example, you know, here in Ontario we have Dyna Labs, or we have the Life Labs.
Right.
How would this differ from their serologies?
Very different. Part of the thing, the way most of these tests that are done is they take the gene that's for, let's say, the spike protein, and they express it in an insect cell or in a bacteria as a recombinant protein. So it's essentially the same as the virus protein, because it's using the same genetic information to construct it. But it's not that cheap. And as a large protein, it has lots of what we call epitopes, regions where an antibody could bind, but you don't know where in that protein is the antibody actually binding, because you're just giving it as a target the entire protein. And so what happens is there is limitations on how much of this material you can put into a test, you know, whether it's the bottom of what we call ELISA plates, or even spotting it onto a membrane. It's very expensive, and you have to spot it as a solution, and you can only make that solution so concentrated. So you don't have the density of the target with using the recombinant proteins. And you have the disadvantage that when you use a whole protein, you may find that you have antibodies against lots of different parts. And again, you don't know which part, but it's also possible that you may have what we call cross-reactivities, antibodies that were not actually against SARS-CoV-2 itself, but are similar enough in their target recognition that they'll work against SARS-CoV-2. So for example, if a person has been infected with some of the cold coronaviruses, which are very common, some of those antibodies can actually react with the recombinant proteins. So you have this issue of the specificity isn't there and the potency isn't there. When we make our synthetic peptide arrays, we're actually making the peptides right on the arrays, which allow us to get to a density that's about 100 times higher than possible with recombinant proteins. So this means that our sensitivity is much, much greater. So for example, we've tested a lot of people who've had COVID-19, they've gone to life labs and they've tested and they get a negative result, maybe about 3 or 4 months after they've recovered from COVID-19. But we can go to those same people a year and a half later, and we can clearly see that they have multiple antibodies against different SARS-CoV-2 proteins. And so we have that, first of it establishes that natural immunity is very long lasting. In fact, we can see people now clearly almost 2 years after infection. And secondly, it's very specific because we know exactly what part of those proteins is it that antibodies that they have are targeting, and they do vary from person to person. So if we're hoping to try to map out which parts are the parts that actually are more protective for a person. For example, if it's binding to the receptor binding domain of the spike protein, which is the part that interacts with ACE2, which allows the virus to get inside cells, then if an antibody binds there, it blocks the ability of the virus to get inside cells. So that's a neutralizing antibody, and that's kind of nice to have. So we can track that sort of thing.
A lot has been made of the durability of the antibody response, and that there were concerns that we might last only 3 months or 6 months, and it also didn't take into account the three levels. So you have antibodies, B cell, and T cell immunity. What could
Right.
you say about those three levels of immunity and the antibody response as a role from the body?
Sure. I mean, as you know, Bruce, it's almost like you have an Army, Navy, and Air Force,
Mm.
and they all coordinate. So what we're seeing in younger children, they don't have much of what we call an adaptive immune response. That is, you have an innate immune response that you're born with, lots of these macrophages and neutrophils that are immune cells that will go out and seek with not so much specificity, but they're very good at least being able to take a new threat that the body hasn't seen before and try to neutralize it. But in people, as they get older and they get exposed to these viruses, they develop the adaptive immune response. So in this case, we're talking mainly about what's called T cells and B cells. And the B cells produce the antibodies, and the T cells are immune cells that go out directly and bind to the target proteins and eat them, whether it's cancer cells or whether it's viruses or bacteria in infection. But they're very specific on what they'll target. And same with the antibodies that are produced by the B cells. They'll lock on to the virus, for example, and they'll act like a beacon to attract the rest of the innate immune system to attack that virus. And the problem, of course, is that with the new vaccines that we are using presently, the RNA vaccines or the adenoviral vaccines, which have DNA, which is then made into RNA inside the cell, which then is made to create your spike protein. The final spike protein with any of these vaccines is presented on the surface of normal human body cells, ideally at the site where you inject, but in reality throughout your entire body, because those lipid nanoparticles that carry the genetic information to make the spike protein do travel in the body. And they concentrate in certain places like the liver, the spleen, the adrenals, and the ovaries, which is of great concern. So what happens is you're basically taking your own body cells so that they look as if they're virus, because they're presenting virus proteins, which the immune system recognizes this isn't normal. So the immune cells attack and kill those cells. And in the process of digesting those cells, they'll take the spike protein and digest it into little pieces. And then these immune cells, neutrophils and macrophages, they'll move to the lymph nodes where the T cells and the B cells reside. And if it so happens that some of those cells have an affinity for that piece, provided that it's presented with these major histocompatibility antigens that are these immune cell proteins, in that context, it can stimulate those cells to grow and divide and multiply. And you create a whole clonal cell line of essentially identical cells that are producing the same antibody, if it's the case of B cells, that will now, those antibodies seek out that little snippet that triggered the growth of that lymphocyte in the first place. And then now you'll have a really good antibody response so that when the virus comes, that antibody will stick to that virus now and again tag it for the immune system to get rid of it. So they're very coordinated.
So in terms of when we're looking at, like, one of the things I've heard is that they've said that the natural immunity provides a more robust but also a more flexible immune response. So that what happens is the analogy that I was said was that if your cousin walked through the door and your cousin had got a haircut, you'd still recognize your cousin, and that the T cell is able to recognize the virus even if there have been modifications, the variants as we've come to call them. So could you speak to that about the body's ability to recognize those variants?
Firstly, the variants in terms of the immune system are not of concern. And the reason is, as I've kind of alluded earlier, when you have an antibody response to a virus, you don't just have like one antibody that you're making that's binding to one part of the virus. You actually have hundreds of different antibodies binding to all these different parts. And so when you have your mutations, you're actually affecting less than 0.3% of the overall structure of the SARS-CoV-2 virus proteins, including the spike protein. So when you have that kind of minor structural alterations, 99% of your immune response is still intact. Even if you have a genetic change with a new variant, you may have been exposed to the Wuhan strain or the Alpha strain and made antibodies, but those antibodies are just as good against the Delta strain. You know, the reduction in immune recognition is barely less than 1%. But beyond that, because of how we've been able to map out which parts of, for example, the spike protein are important for making antibodies against, remarkably, we find that where each of those mutations are in, let's say, the Delta variant, these aren't the parts of the spike protein that people make antibodies against in the first place. So it's actually irrelevant, those mutations, for the ability of your immune system to recognize new strains of the virus, provided that, you know, they're typically just, like I say, in less than 0.3% of the overall amino acid structure of the proteins. So the mutations don't really matter when it comes to your immune response.
In terms of the young people, in terms of children and youth, I've heard that it said that they don't even really have the receptors or developed the receptors necessary to interact with the virus. Maybe you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, there's 2 points there, and you're absolutely right. But before I answer that question, I should finish off the other question,
right.
which actually was the difference between the antibodies that you would get, let's say, from a vaccine versus the natural immunity. Natural immunity, of course, is against all of the proteins on the virus. The ones that count are the ones that are on the surface of the virus, frankly. So the spike protein is a good target in a vaccine. The only difficulty is that you're actually presenting a pathogenic part of that virus on your normal body cells. So some of the same responses that are destructive that are generating from the virus, like, for example, blood clotting, is induced also by the spike protein on your own cells. So that's one, that you have a more broader immune response. Two, as I've mentioned already, we know with natural immunity that immune response can last for in fact years. And we've actually detected in people using the same technology with probes for SARS-CoV-1, the presence of antibodies in people today for this virus that was around 17 years ago. So you have that durability of what we call immune memory, and that does not seem to be happening with any of these current vaccines that are on the market in Canada. Clearly, within 6 months, most of the protection provided by these um, antibodies, even after double vaccination, is not lasting. But the third thing that's important is that when you are injecting your arm and you're getting an immune response in your blood system, you're developing primarily IgG type antibodies. And these are good antibodies. They last 21 days, they're very specific. But in your lungs and airway spaces, which is how you're going to get exposed to the virus in the first place, there's actually very little IgG that's in those spaces. Instead, the body uses a slightly different class of antibodies called IgA and IgM antibodies, and they're secreted into those spaces. And they provide the first line of defense. And so if you, in fact, have natural immunity, you have those antibodies. And even the cells that produce those antibodies are actually even in your lung spaces and airway spaces. So you get a much more natural protection at the place where you're most likely to get infected with the virus. So I kind of make the analogy of having a castle with guards everywhere, except at the front gate. And so the perpetrator gets in, does its work. In this case, the virus replicates, and then it leaves. So that's why we now know today, and nobody argues this, that if you are vaccinated, you can still get infected and you can still transmit the virus. So in this case, then, those are three good reasons why natural immunity is better, but you also avoid vaccine injury, which is an entirely different topic. Now, in the case of children, they have this natural higher levels of the innate immune system. That is probably okay at that stage, in part because the body is starting to still learn what is self and what is not self. And so your adaptive immune response needs that time to get educated about not making antibodies against yourself. So we call that tolerance. So you're right. Firstly, they have a stronger innate immune system, so the virus doesn't get that far. And secondly, as you pointed out, the levels of the ACE2 protein, which is the receptor for allowing the virus to get inside cells, is lower levels in children. So it's harder for the virus to get inside the cells and takes longer for it to spread and replicate. So that gives more time for their immune system to take it out before the virus becomes much of a threat, to the point where they'll start to get sick. So in fact, most children and most adults, as it turns out, don't have any symptoms from SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19, the disease, or it's very, very mild. But we do have people that are sensitive, and there are very high risk groups. And one of them is people that are obese. And one of the reasons why is that the fat cells, the adipocytes, have high levels of ACE2. So it's exactly where the virus is going to want to go. And it's kind of like a huge breeding ground for the virus. So that's why people that are obese are actually at greater risk. And then elderly people, their immune systems don't work as well as they get older, partly from the sedentary lifestyle. They're not getting out and getting exposed on a regular basis to germs in the environment. And so when they do get infected, their immune systems aren't quite as strong. I think if an elderly person was out there very active in the environment, I think actually they would have very good immunity. But people in nursing homes is a different story.
So there's a bunch of things I want to pick up on there. And first things first is that at what age does that innate immunity start to move into the adaptive immunity, or is that sort of a slow transition? And
Yeah, I
does
think
that occur in your 20s, or when does that happen?
yeah, we know for sure children that are under 11 certainly have very strong innate immune systems. We have certainly tested people that are actually as well. We've actually tested through a study that done with the BC Women's and Children's Hospital babies. They have no antibodies. It's amazing. Our blots are completely white except for our control spot. So we know we start off with essentially no antibodies. Now, these, of course, are weaned babies. Like they're not getting the antibodies from their mother's milk. So
Mm.
this is one of the reasons why, having breastfeeding your baby is actually a good idea because it does provide immune protection for your baby. But as it turns out, when you look across Canada and worldwide, the number of young children that actually get COVID and are hospitalized is incredibly rare. In fact, interestingly, I read a report recently where they looked at, I think it was more than 60,000, if I got that number correct, children that were hospitalized in the United States. And then they looked at how many people of those children died. And it turns out that there was no case they could find of a baby, a young child that died from COVID-19 itself, from the SARS-CoV-1. They had other complications that were exacerbated by that condition, and then they died. But it wasn't a healthy young child that got SARS-CoV-1 and then died. But you can calculate that if you're under 18, and this is like in North America, your chances if you're under 18 of being hospitalized is 1 in 100,000. And if you are, in terms of the number that actually die, it's less than 1 in 1 million chance of dying. So for younger people, the risks from the virus, obviously the innate immune system is working extremely well. And that transition, I suspect, is fairly slow through the teen years. And then as we get to be an adult, we still have an innate immune system. It's still there. It's just that it's being augmented and made even more efficient
Mm.
by having our adaptive immune system working with it.
It's fascinating. One of the things you were talking about the elderly and how their immune response is sort of affected by their lifestyle and how much they interact with the world. But
Right.
and I know that they've said that there's a depression of your immune system after getting a vaccination. Does the same thing happen during your a natural immune response? Do you when your body is fighting, does that depress your immunity as well?
Yes, I mean, this is one of the concerns of having all these restrictive practices where people are isolated, they can't see their loved ones. Um, the whole handling of the pandemic has been such that we have much higher rates of anxiety, of depression, and these themselves actually depress your immune system, and they make it easier for a virus or a bacteria or even cancer cells to thrive in your body. So there's a balance here. You don't want an overly active immune system because then it'll actually will start attacking your own tissues. And in fact, the irony of COVID-19 is that initially it's the virus that is causing you your problems. The symptoms you have is actually your immune system being turned on, the elevated temperatures, the tenderness. Basically, this is the coughing and all. This is the way your body's reacting to get rid of a foreign threat. And that's partly an immune response there. But later, the people that actually get really ill, by that point, the virus is largely under control. The issue is that their immune system is now so active, and with the swelling, the airway spaces are basically um, constricted and from the immune response, and so you actually have what we call a cytokine storm. Your immune system is acting too much, and so in fact, the therapy that was effective for people that were hospitalized, of course, to get them air and to improve their breathing, is to actually give them immune suppressors. And that's what dexamethasone, for example, does. So it's a different problem by the time they get to the hospital. And what you really want to do is to have therapies that are very effective, antivirals, but when they first get infected, to try to have it so that the immune response doesn't get to a point where now it gets out of control, but it's enough there to eradicate the virus.
So in a sense, you're trying to calm the body before the inflammatory stage, because when the body starts to attack itself, now it's out of control. And that would seem to be the logic with, we always used to talk about bolstering our immune systems, and
Right.
I think it's interesting now that we're really talking more about regulating. Like that's what the vitamin D3 is doing. It's helping to regulate the immune response. Is that correct?
That's right. So vitamin D3 is actually necessary for a good immune response. And of course, you can get it through your skin with sunlight, or you can get it in your diet. Sometimes supplements are advised. We live in a northern climate. We in the wintertime we get much less sun. This is one of the reasons why we tend to have more flus and colds. In the winter, our immune system is a little bit more depressed. And also psychologically, when there's less sunlight out there, it's more depressing. And so all these factors come into play. So if you're dark skinned, you're even more at risk here because you're not making the vitamin D3 in your skin as easily because the extra melanin is actually filtering out some of that sun. In terms of trying to look at how is it that many people work today? They're working in offices. They have clothes on. It's just very little of their body actually is exposed to natural light, and the light that they have in their offices is often it's quite dark, and it's just their computer screen is basically what's lighting them up. So it's probably the one benefit of your computer screen is that it's actually giving you a little bit of vitamin D3. So anyways, there's things that you can do to improve your immune function, and getting sleep, trying to meditate, and with all the stresses that you have there, you have to try to be able to find ways to reduce your stress, because that stress does affect your immune system. So
This is something
exercise also helps.
I wanted to pick up on because I think I've heard that one of the most common comorbidities it was fear or anxiety, and that people
Right.
were so afraid that they'd been diagnosed with COVID that they began to panic. And maybe you could talk a little bit about how that works into this and into the immune response.
Well, yes. I mean, when you have what's called stress hormones that are released when you're stressed. Some of these are steroid type hormones, and basically what they do is they turn down the immune system, because again, your immune system is tightly regulated so that it's there when you need it, but you don't want to have it super active. So that's why, for example, when you have B cells that are producing antibodies, they're very effective against that virus. uh, if there is no threat, you don't want those cells producing those antibodies anymore, because if every B cell that you had was pumping out all the antibodies that it could, your blood would be so thick, your heart wouldn't be able to pump it.
Mm.
So it's very important that you have that fine balance, and that's controlled both by mind and body. Connection is there largely, that's through hormonal control. And we actually produce a lot of blood cells every day. If you look at stool, a lot of that is dead blood cells, including immune cells. If stool didn't have so much blood in it, it'd actually be white.
Mm.
That's all from the hemoglobin. So this is one of the groups of cells that turns over the greatest in your body. And one of the things that I find interesting is that immune suppressed people, they have immune deficiencies. There's a concern that they're more prone to have these viruses spread in their body, and I think that's correct to a certain extent. But the problem is, if you're compromised that way to begin with, if you're given a vaccine, it's not clear that the vaccine is going to be that effective either. But here's the rub, and it's how these vaccines, with the RNA vaccines and adenovirus vaccines, actually work. Because as I mentioned earlier, they deliver genetic material inside the cell that instructs the cells to make the spike proteins. Spike proteins on the surface of those cells. You get an immune attack, it's inflammation, and then the pieces of that spike protein are presented, and you make antibodies against the spike protein that takes on the virus. However, you are also producing um, destruction of your own body cells and their proteins, and they're being presented in pieces to your immune system as well. And normally you have tolerance where you don't really, you're not expected to trigger the production of antibodies against yourself. However, we all know that with aging, we actually do get the breakage of tolerance. So whether it's type 1 diabetes or lupus or arthritis or colitis or Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, these are all examples of diseases that can result from basically inflammatory responses to your own body tissues. And they can sometimes be triggered by viruses, but ultimately the viruses are long gone. And then now the body's in a cycle of making more and more antibodies against itself and more T cells that are activated against self antigens, we call these, the parts that the antibodies or the T cells are recognizing in the body's proteins. So how do you deal with these immune reactions where you have an overactive immune system? Well, people go on immunosuppressive drugs. And if you go on immunosuppressive drugs, it means that you're actually more susceptible now to cancer and to viruses and bacteria and other pathogens. So it may well be, and again, this is hypothetical because it's too early to tell how many people will be affected in this way, but we certainly know at this stage that if it's something like myocarditis, which is an inflammatory response against your own heart cells, that people that are under 24, it's estimated, for example, by the Public Health Authority in Ontario, that you have about a 1 in 5,000 chance of getting myocarditis if you're under 24 and you've taken the Moderna vaccine, for example. And the other vaccines are all associated with myocarditis as well. We don't know necessarily the risk calculation for those. Some people say it's maybe 1 in 20,000 for Pfizer, but ultimately there is a risk. So now think about this: if you're a young child and your chances of being hospitalized or dying is 1 in 100,000 from the vaccine, from the virus, and your chances 1 in 5,000 from actually getting myocarditis, and that's just one of the injuries that can happen from vaccines, then becomes a pretty obvious that your children are much safer being infected with the virus than they are actually getting vaccinated. And of course, now we're advocating vaccination of children from 5 to 11. And they've approved that in the United States. But on the other hand, in places like the Scandinavian countries, Sweden and Denmark, they're not approving these vaccines for people under 30 because it's concern of myocarditis. So when you think about the science, what science is being applied by these different governments, presumably the facts are the facts. So we're seeing is the application of these policies is not really aligned with the science that's there and the actual risks. So then you have to, what is it?
One of the things I think that's been used to drive parents towards vaccinating their children has been the specter of long COVID. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see long COVID manifesting. And I know several individuals that have believed that that the research is sort of pointing to the fact that it is bringing back illnesses from the past, or people have.
No, I think that's right, because if you look at the people who get long COVID, usually they're in the high risk groups to begin with. And what has happened is there's at least over 80% of them have comorbidities that they already have damage to their body, and going through about with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, it actually exacerbates those conditions, because again, your immune system is really active, and certainly if you have immune reactions like autoimmune disease, that's a problem to begin with. But secondly, what the spike protein does is it activates platelets, and platelets cause thrombosis, and you get microclots. In fact, I think Charles Hoff, Dr. Charles Hoff, he's done studies And he's not the only one, because we've heard of other doctors who've been doing this too with their patients. That, but Charles Hoff found that about 60% of his, he has about 1,000 patients, that 60% of those people that were vaccinated had D-dimer at very high levels. And D-dimer is a breakdown from clots. So these tend to be in microclots, but don't forget microclots can cause things like mini strokes. But for the interesting thing is that when we talk about people with long COVID, and by the way, most people that do have long COVID do recover. It just takes a long time. But we can see that this kind of injury can happen in people that are very athletic, that are pushing their bodies to the extremes. So they're not usually doing it when they've got COVID-19, but they're doing it when they've been vaccinated. And the very same protein, the spike protein that can activate platelets, is there in their bodies, and they're getting clotting. And when you're exerting such great stresses on your body, in high performance athletes, this is the reason why we're seeing not only myocarditis occurring in younger people, but we're seeing actually some of them are even dying from it. And we have to make it really clear to your audience that there's no such thing as mild myocarditis. Mm-hmm. It's an irreversible disease. Mm-hmm. that when you have myocarditis, those dead muscle cells of the heart are not replaced by muscle cells. They're replaced by connective tissue, usually with fibroblasts. And what's happening is those connective tissue doesn't have contractile function. So what has to happen is the surrounding muscle cells have to compensate. This means that they have to get bigger. And when they get bigger, your heart gets bigger. Mm-hmm. And the bigger your heart, when you pump, you get more blood pressure. And the more blood pressure you get, the more breakage that you can get of platelets and drive arterial sclerosis and also strokes. So to initiate such a process early in the life of a young person, you're really subjecting them to a much faster rate of heart disease and potentially stroke. So this is not a good idea to vaccinate young children just on that basis alone.
I just wanted to pick up on something you said, that when you're looking at the long COVID, you're saying that it often is people with have high comorbidities. Mm-hmm. But even then, is it possible that if the body is, the virus is calm before you reach the inflammatory stage, the incidences of long COVID would be reduced?
Yes, I think so, because much of the damage and destruction you're seeing is from your own immune system. That's causing most of the problem, because you're eliminating the virus. So the virus is at very low levels by that point. When you're in hospital, you can still detect it, but it's not very high viral load in the sense that your immune system has been working really well. But there's still going to be virus there, and it's going to be detected by PCR, because in the hospital, the cycle number that they're using is actually so high. The higher the number of PCR cycles that you do, the less accurate the test is. So we know that if you're somewhere around 24 to 29 cycles, that if you took that material and you infected cells with it, there'd be active virus there and it would kill those cells. But when you're starting to go with each cycle, basically each cycle doubles the number of molecules of the virus RNA. Well, actually, we start with the RNA, and then it's made to DNA, and then we're doubling DNA copies. And so what ends up happening is, as you know, when you're doubling, you start with 2, you're 4, and then you're 8 and 16 and 32. But as you start to go to 2 to the 39th power, you're now talking about billions and billions of copies. And what ends up happening is you start to amplify little bits and pieces of the virus that are left over, that in fact the virus is long gone and dead, but you're going to get a positive result, and you're going to think that that person is still actively shedding the virus, and they're not. What they're shedding is just the remnants of the traces of the virus that's there. Mm-hmm. So it's really the destruction in long COVID by your own body's immune system as collateral damage as it's trying to settle down, and you have again that cytokine storm that stimulates more and more of your immune system to come into action.
I've heard that we actually are using, I've heard of cycle thresholds being as high as 45. And
Yeah,
you're saying it's somewhere between, should be somewhere between
should be less than
23 and
30.
28.
Should be less than 30.
Yeah.
And it's standard to do greater than 35. And the problem is that that's also the standard that we used for determining in our clinical trials whether or not these vaccines actually work. So in the original Pfizer trials, where they have determination of whether a person was actually had COVID or not, wasn't even necessarily based on whether they were sick or not. It was based on whether or not they were PCR positive using cycle thresholds that were over 35.
Mm.
And the other problem, of course, with those trials in determining the efficacy of the vaccines is that the pre-screening to determine whether or not a person already had natural immunity was not really done very well. It was based on a single marker. And as we talked about earlier, those tests are not that sensitive, especially when you're basing it on a single marker. So we don't even know how many people in those clinical trials where you have your vaccine group and your unvaccinated group, and you're comparing how effective the vaccine has been in preventing COVID-19. First of all, it's not necessarily indicating prevention of sickness. It's indicating prevention of detection of the virus using using cycle numbers where you get positive results that actually don't exist, because that person could have easily been around somebody else who had SARS-CoV-2 and breathing in the virus pieces and then giving a positive result.
I spoke to an expert recently who said that one of the issues is that we're not even irrigating the nasal cavity before we do these PCRs. So you can be picking up extraneous material that is not even related to what's actually happening in the body.
In your own body, exactly.
Yeah.
Because you breathe in dust all the time. I mean, you just look on a sunny day and you're in a dark space and you can see the streams of light with all the little dust particles lighting up. Oh, you're breathing that stuff into your lungs continually. In fact, about 20% of the cells that are in your lungs are macrophages that are going out there and just cleaning up all that stuff that gets into your lungs from just breathing in from the environment. And that definitely includes remnants of the virus. And, for example, people can look at sewage water and do the PCR test and detect the presence of the virus. Now, that's clearly not active virus in sewage water, but you can detect it. And so people are using that to get a sense of, in certain communities, how prevalent is the virus based on how much of the remnants of the virus is in there, easily detected with the PCR test.
Now, you going back to your test, one of the things I found interesting, you said you have about just over 1,500 participants. And I imagine the results would be somewhat skewed because these are people who in many cases would suspect that they actually have had COVID already, but they're trying to get an indication. But what have your results shown in terms of the number of the percentage of the participants that have actually have had COVID according to your test?
Right. And you're absolutely right. Our data may be slightly skewed because people have either have had COVID a long time ago or suspected, because as you know, really in British Columbia, we had the lowest rates of testing by the PCR test in the first wave in early 2020. And then on top of that, they may have had a family member that was infected, but they were okay. So we see about 90% of the people we test actually have antibodies against multiple parts, multiple proteins of the virus, and multiple parts of those proteins. Now, we know also, though, that we were involved in a study with the BC Women's and Children's Hospital. Dr. Pascal Lebois was the lead on that, but we actually had two separate tests that were done to determine whether or not a person had antibodies. There was the original test they used with using the recombinant proteins for the spike and the nucleocapsid protein that we talked about earlier, and using the more traditional approach, but they had a fairly sensitive platform that they used, mesoscale devices is the company that produces that. And they found in their study 276 healthy adults. About half of them were healthcare workers. Only 5 of them had been diagnosed as having COVID-19. So as it turns out, 90% of those people tested positive. Now we took um, a subset of those, about 50 of those, and retested them using our test. And we completely confirmed not only did these people have antibodies against the spike and nucleocapsid protein, but they had it against many of the other SARS-CoV-2 proteins too. So I think in the general population, the number is actually quite high because that was in the first wave. It's been a year and a half essentially since then. Now, ICOR Blood Services in Alberta uses the more traditional test, and they report that 40% of their unvaccinated people test positive in their tests. And again, that's using nucleocapsid and spike protein. And that's been done really at the Mayo Clinic. They actually outsource that. Now, if you take the PCR test, we're about around 5%, 6% of our population has tested positive by PCR, bearing in mind that there is false positives. But in the United States, the Center for Disease Control did an estimate that for every person that had tested positive by PCR, they estimated that was about at least 4 times that number who were actually infected. That had they been tested by PCR, they would have gotten infected. So you can take our number of around 5-6% and multiply that by 4. So then you're starting to look at, well, probably at least a quarter of the population in Canada already has natural immunity just based on the PCR test. So I think that the numbers are such that I'm not surprised if 80% of the population actually has natural immunity. I seriously doubt that less than 5 or 6% of the population has natural immunity, and that's the number that basically the ABC study by Angus Reid and the University of Toronto has provided from their study using a dried blood cell test and measuring again spike protein and nucleocapsid protein, the recombinant proteins. That's the number they come up with, and that's the number that Health Canada and informs basically our public health authorities into the degree of natural immunity in our country. And of course, that's modeled in to all of these models predicting basically how the virus will spread in our population. So we actually are using very bad data to get a sense of the extent of natural immunity in our population. And that's why the drive to try to vaccinate everybody possible, now down to 5-year-olds. And that just doesn't make any sense.
Have you seen any evidence of reinfection in the work you've done? Have you seen any evidence of the spike protein interacting in multiple times in a body?
Right. So you're wondering, I think, that if you had COVID-19
Yes.
and you recovered,
Yeah.
are you going to get COVID-19 again and get sick or at least spread it? And the answer to that question is there is a number of studies where this has been examined in the scientific literature. And basically, my observations based on what I've read, and again, it varies because the pandemic is a moving feast, right? Because as you have more people protected, then and because they're vaccinated, they're losing their protection over time. It's really hard to judge this. But I do know, for example, in one study that was done a few months ago in Israel, that they found that out of the people that were in hospital at that time, that about 50% of them were double vaccinated, and about 49% of them were unvaccinated, and 1% of them were actually had COVID-19 before. So based on that, I think your chances of getting sick again, if you already had COVID-19, is probably 1 in 100.
Mm.
Now, we know that people who've been vaccinated after about 6 months, it looks like about 80% of the protection they had is gone. So there's going to be a segment of the population that still has some immune protection, but a lot of those people won't have immune protection. And so that's why pretty much most people now in Israel are triple vaccinated. Now, already they're saying this is it. We have 10 times less people in hospital now in Israel that are triple vaccinated than double vaccinated. And so if you're double vaccinated now in Israel, you're not considered vaccinated anymore. And so their passports no longer apply to those people. So in order to be really vaccinated, triple vaccinated, right now we're at the stage where we're happy if you're double vaccinated. But I assure you, if we continue on this track, probably by into the new year, if you're not triple vaccinated, whatever vaccine status you had is long gone. And that's sort of the problem with this.
What impact would the triple vaccination and these recurring booster shots? What would that have on your vascular system? Like
Exactly.
introducing the spike protein continuously. What will happen with that?
Exactly. I mean, this is what I alluded to earlier, that if in order to make antibodies, you have to elicit an inflammatory attack against your own tissue. We know that the way you break tolerance is you have repeated inflammatory attacks against the same tissues. So the more you vaccinate, the higher the risks of actually vaccine injury. Now, in Canada, we're told that these vaccines are safe, but I think the Canadian system is very, very flawed in terms of tracking vaccine injury, and for a variety of reasons. I mean, one obvious thing is that when you look at the data, as vaccination rates take off in May, like a hockey stick, during the same period, adverse reactions to the vaccines is actually slightly declining. I mean, you expect the two to go together. And if you look at the ratio of severe reactions versus mild reactions, and severe means hospitalized or died, and the ratio early on in the vaccine program, which is actually with elderly people, so they're the ones you think would be even more susceptible to severe reactions, it's about maybe 10-15%. But as you look, as we go into the more recent months, it's about 40-50% of all the reported reactions are actually severe. And then you look at the total number of people that are reporting, and 75% are female, 25% are male, which tells you that those numbers must be at least twofold out. Now, and it's because of the difficulty of reporting in our system. It's in a 5-page form. It's got to be filled by a doctor. It takes them 20 minutes. It's filtered that if it doesn't meet certain criteria, they just basically go ahead and notify the person that, no, it's safe for you to have the vaccine. We don't think that your injury is related to the vaccine. So I know doctors have filed 6 cases, and all 6 cases are rejected. And then those files from the central authorities, health authorities, go then to central authority, and then they're further filtered. So how do we get a sense of vaccine injury, in fact? And I think you can look at United States, and they have a VAERS system that's been in business for, tracking vaccine injury for 30 years. And if you look at all the reports of vaccine injury, over 800,000 related to the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines, basically what you see is that 40% of all reported injuries over 30 years has been in like 10 months with the 3 vaccines, which doesn't include the AstraZeneca vaccine, which they don't have in the United States because it wasn't approved there, nor was it approved in about 12 countries in Europe. And yet in Canada, we went ahead and got that vaccine because, as it turns out, somehow we got kind of short shrifted relative to other countries for access. And then what happened was in Ontario, you saw originally it was 1 in 500,000 with myocarditis. And then over a course of time, it got to almost like 1 in 50,000 cases of myocarditis. Sorry, not myocarditis, thrombosis, pardon me. So blood clotting. And at that point, Ontario said, we're not using this vaccine anymore. Of course, in British Columbia, we're still using AstraZeneca.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's really interesting. So that's what I was saying earlier. Different health authorities seem to have different criteria what they think constitutes sufficient risk for their population, and I think it's balanced versus the availability of the vaccines in the first place. So, for example, all across Canada, Pfizer basically said, as was true for Moderna, you vaccinate and then you do a booster shot a month later. We didn't have enough vaccines in Canada, so we said, okay, it's okay to do 4 months. Nobody recommended 4 months. There was no data to support that. In fact, it's kind of interesting. I'm seeing now people saying that that was a really smart thing to do, because what happened was we established immune memory. But we don't really know that we have immune memory by doing that, because everybody, the bulk of the population has been vaccinated, double vaccinated by May and June is when it started taking off. So it's really the summer months where you've got these antibody levels probably at their peak, and they'll wane. But as we now start going into the further into the fall and winter, we're seeing in the hospitals now the cases of breakthrough COVID is steadily increasing. Double vaccinated people are now getting this, and not only are they getting in the hospitals, but they're getting very sick and they're dying. So, this concept that, well, by being double vaccinated, yes, you can still get infected. Yes, you can still transmit, but you're less likely to die. I'm not sure that's necessarily true from the data we've seen. There's certainly some people that are dying that are double vaccinated. And we've seen cases of this. I mean, one of the more visible cases was Colin Powell,
Yeah.
right? And so, this is very problematic. And the other thing too is when you're very elderly and you're getting these vaccines and you're getting these immune responses, sometimes if you're very feeble, it may actually kill you. And so in the VAERS system, we have at least 8,000 reports of death associated with those 3 vaccines. Now, the VAERS system, it's believed in the US for vaccine injury reporting that only about 2% of actual cases get reported in that system. So most people that work with that system take the numbers and multiply by 30. So, 30 times, 8,000, 240,000. Well, that's a pretty high number. I don't think personally that it's that high, but when you have 700,000 deaths from the virus in the US, and you're getting numbers that could be in the 100,000 or higher from the vaccine to prevent that, and you're subjecting healthy people to that, right? Not people that are necessarily at risk of getting COVID-19 because they don't have comorbidities or fit the general risk profile. That's really dangerous, and you can't support that.
Well, I think one of the things that's really mystifying to me, at least, is that there's no one seems to be looking at what's actually happening. For example, in old age homes, you have them coming in with a vaccine program. You have these individuals living in a long-term care facility. They're intermixed. Now they have a depressed immune response for about, could be 2 weeks, could be 3. And in that time, you're finding, I think we're finding a lot of the elderly are passing away from other ailments, and they're, it's so weak in their response, and no one's tracking that. And so we don't really even know the full effect that this might be having on the elderly, for example.
No,
And I
the
think this is
elderly.
one of the great crimes, is that our inability to protect those individuals.
Yeah, I mean, two points here from my viewpoint is one, who really came up with the idea of taking people in nursing homes and these residential places for elderly people, that when they were sick, you leave them in there, and you might put them in a different room, but with the ventilation systems that are there, we know this virus is transmitted in an aerosol. So in fact, as you keep more people that are sick in that environment, you increase the concentration of the pathogen in the atmosphere. So you actually are creating a killing zone,
Mm.
basically, for the people that were healthy. So one of the reasons why the death rates have dramatically dropped in the last year, ever since December, they've been continually dropping. We have, our waves, but when you look carefully at the waves related to case numbers, the death numbers are actually quite relatively low. Nothing like what we saw in the second wave.
Mm.
So basically, what's happened is those elderly people, some people will make the argument, well, they've been vaccinated, and so they're protected by the vaccines, but they probably have acquired natural immunity or they've died,
Mm.
and those people that are left are hardier. So we've seen dramatic drops in the death rates for people that are over 80, over 70. Their death rates are actually approaching people that are more in the 60s now.
Mm.
So I think that's one thing. Um, Geez, I forgot what my second point was. Getting late in the night.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things in prior conversations I postulated to you that I think one of the things that is fascinating is that you would think that our government would be putting a rigorous effort into assessing who had COVID, and so a sensitive test like yours,
Mhm.
which would really allow us to, even if we were just looking at using the vaccine in a widespread manner, would allow us to prioritize who should be getting the vaccine. And the
Right.
inability and the lack of willingness upon of the government to do that seems to me to indicate that they felt that the naturally immune people would bolster the effectiveness, the seeming effectiveness of the vaccine. Because if you have that core of individuals who have natural immunity, and you were saying that you think it's closer to 25-30%, that would be bolstering the numbers of the efficacy of the vaccines. That was my theory.
Yeah. Well, see, most people that have been vaccinated that we test actually already have antibodies against the other proteins too, which means either they were previously infected with the virus before they were vaccinated, or the vaccine didn't do a very good job of preventing them from being infected, and they may very well have been spreaders. I think what this concept that the unvaccinated, that now when we have these incidents of COVID-19 cases, it's a pandemic of the unvaccinated. This is just completely crazy, because when you got 90% of your population vaccinated and you're giving them immunity passports to go wherever they want into crowds, and at the same time, that they're going to get infected and that they will transmit, then to blame it on the remaining 10%, which also has that natural immunity, which, like I say, I think is more than half of those people. Um, it's ridiculous to blame everything on probably 5% of people that have not got natural immunity, that have not yet been vaccinated, um, which probably, if they do encounter the virus, many of them probably would develop, um, be asymptomatic. And if you're asymptomatic, your chances of spreading it is much lower. So if you look at children, they're primarily asymptomatic. They are not spreaders. Studies have been done ad nauseum on this. I know one study here in the Vancouver area, 107 schools, they looked, 3/4 of them didn't have any cases of COVID-19 by the PCR test or by serological test. So the other ones had very few cases. When you track it, you find that actually it's someone else in the family that gave it to their brother or sister. And in terms of transmission from students to teachers, there's no really good documented cases. That there is the other way around.
Mm.
It's really the teachers that are putting the students at greater risk of getting COVID-19 than the students to the students. And that's because the viral load is very low.
Mm.
And when you don't have symptoms, you're not like coughing and creating these aerosols as easily. So, so this vaccine passports, it really makes no sense. We should be looking to see whether or not a person has evidence of immunity. And if you really want to do that kind of testing, then that would be the way to go. There really was no, we tried with our company many times to get government grants to develop our tests. We've developed them internally funded. And the issue is really that we don't even get past the letter of intent when it comes time for some of these grant applications. And then if I see where the money goes, it's really hard to fathom. It's like, don't you want to know what's really happened? Because the PCR test tells you if you're infected at that moment, but it'll never tell you whether you had been infected. The only way to do that is with a serological test, either for T cells or B cell antibody production.
Well, this is the thing that I find so mystifying about the PCR is that, as an educator, if I was giving a test and the success rate of the test was in like 1 or 2%, then I would think that that test was not sensitive enough to actually assess the material that I was delivering. And so, if if you're giving 100 tests and you're only able to discern 1 or 2% of the people, then I think you would have to find another way, another manner in which to test those individuals.
Sure. And right now we're using the rapid antigen test that we're subjecting people to if they're not vaccinated. I mean, if they're vaccinated, we don't seem to care because we know that they're still transmitters. But we do this rapid antigen test, and that test, is usually for the nucleocapsid protein. It's one marker. And even the manufacturer of that test doesn't recommend using it in the first couple of days. It's not sensitive enough.
Right.
And so we have a very insensitive test that unless you're really, really sick, you're not going to test positive. And then if you test positive, then they want you to get a PCR test, which is way more sensitive. So if your insensitive test is showing you that you've got the antigen of the virus there, why are you doing a PCR test on top of that? And that's what we're doing, for example, at the University of British Columbia. It's such an incredible waste of money that's going on with all this testing, where you can do one test, determine whether or not the person has antibodies, and if they do, then it's clear if it's by natural immunity, it's good for years. If you get a test and it's by vaccine, well, if they don't have antibodies against the other proteins besides the spike protein, then you might be concerned that that immunity may wane. But if they've got antibodies against the other proteins too, then you know that they've got natural immunity, and then you don't need to test them either, right? So I don't get it. But at the end of the day, I just don't believe in vaccine passports because where does that take you eventually? Are we going to start testing if a person has hepatitis or AIDS, and then we want to demand to know what were your tests?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a clear violation of a person's medical information to demand that of an individual, and I just don't like the direction that takes us as a society.
Yeah, one of the things I've always felt or had felt for some time now is that I thought the way to go would be to have like these the quick and dirty saliva tests, because I sort of feel like even if they're not as accurate as some of these other tests, the antigen tests, that on aggregate you would be catching more people getting, who are you may not get it on day one, but you might get it on day two or get day three, and because they're more accessible, you would on aggregate get a better indication of whether people are sick.
We actually have looked at saliva. It's a little bit difficult because the concentrations of the antibodies in saliva depend a lot on how much you're secreting, your fluids into saliva. And we do have to slightly concentrate it. So it's not great stuff to work with.
Mm-hmm.
But I do agree with you that effort could be spent to develop a better spit test that would work just as well as a blood test that'd be less invasive.
Mm-hmm.
But we're a small company. We just don't have the resources to really develop that at this point. And so we've put that on the back burner. We did apply. The National Research Council of Canada actually had a call for development of a saliva test, and we applied. But again, we didn't get past the letter of intent. And a year later, I don't see any studies with saliva tests coming out of the NRC.
Right.
Mhm.
What do you think? Where do you think the applications for your testing methods would go at, let's say post COVID? What can you do with the tests that you've come up with? How do you think it could be a benefit to society?
Sure. Well, I think in a sense, the way we've done this and applied this technology to being able to determine, like I say, we've learned a number of things that the pattern is very different from person to person. So we know that if your test is dependent on just a couple of markers, you're going to miss out and get false positives or negatives. For example, I had one person who was sick, had COVID, went out a month later, got tested at Life Labs, came back negative. No antibodies from that test. 6 months later, we tested that person and they were loaded with antibodies,
Mm.
but they didn't have any antibodies against the nucleocapsid protein. So that's why the Life Labs test didn't work. So having multiple markers, that's very hard to put that into platforms like ELISA assays, which are typically used now for tests, or are these like one-use tests where there's a single marker. Um, so there's no reason that we can't take our technology and apply it to any pathogen, virus or bacteria, where there are proteins on the surface that we know their gene sequences and very rapidly develop a diagnostic test to determine whether or not a person has been exposed to that, taking advantage of the body's own ability to create antibodies. If we can monitor that, we can monitor basically that they were infected.
Mm.
And where that's very useful is that, well, let's say if we now know that certain parts of these proteins elicit a very strong antibody response, then we can do what we've always been doing in rabbits, take those short peptides and inject them into people, and they become really good vaccines because we know where they are. The people make a very strong immune response. It's not the intact protein like the spike protein, for example, that's still pathogenic. It's a piece. It's
Mm.
already pre-digested to a certain extent, so the immune cells can take it up much easier,
Mm.
and you'll get a good, strong, robust immune response, which is what we've always done for the last 20 years in making antibodies in rabbits. So you can develop vaccines as well as better tests for diagnosis.
In
Uh,
that sense, you're not subjecting the body to the spike protein in
exactly.
on a cycle of every 5 months or 6 months, wherever we're going to
That's
end
right.
up
And,
with
and
these.
making peptides is much cheaper than making recombinant proteins.
Mm.
So you can create vaccines that way, and that's one of the reasons why when we originally started our clinical trial, that was one of the directions that we thought we could go. But then again, um, when you've got all these 200 companies developing vaccines for SARS-CoV-2, we know the ones that have made it to the marketplace first, but in reality, there's many other companies doing other approaches.
Mm.
Novavax, Covovax in Canada, for example, but all around the world, Sinovax, they're all these are all developing vaccines and more traditional approaches, probably much safer vaccines because you're not using an inflammatory reaction against your own body cells
Mm.
that are producing that protein for you. My concern is that if we apply this technology to now influenza vaccines and many of the other vaccines that we're contemplating, when you have your third shot of the Pfizer vaccine for SARS-CoV-2, and now you're getting a shot for influenza, that's like your fourth shot.
Mm.
And so you'll get cumulative effects, which again have the same problem that we had with the possibility of developing an immune reaction. You may not have the same issues of thrombosis that you see with the spike protein, but there may be other issues. But certainly you'll have an inflammatory response against your own tissues that will probably precipitate autoimmune disease in time. And of course, if it's certain organs like the ovaries, that's pretty serious because when a woman is, when a baby girl is born, all of the oocytes that she's going to have for the rest of her life are already in her, in basically in her ovaries. And you have a few, maybe 10,000 or so oocytes when you're born. But as you go through life, a lot of those oocytes die. One of them gets converted into an egg that's fertilizable with every period. And then after about 400 periods, you run out of eggs.
Mm.
Now, if you turn out to have an inflammatory response that causes damage to the ovaries, you may end up having far fewer oocytes by the time you're at the stage of where you want to have children,
Mm.
and your chances may be dramatically reduced. So I don't think it's worth playing with. I don't think pregnant women should be vaccinated, unless they're at very high risks of comorbidities, and you're not really worried about the life of the unborn baby relative to the mother. Then I think you can make a pretty good case. But if you have a healthy mother and there's no reason to believe that the child um, has got any issues, you're the baby, you're better to have basically non-vaccinated. It was never tested originally in pregnant women. It was
Excuse me.
actually never tested in people over age 70. It
Yeah.
wasn't tested in people that had comorbidities.
Yeah.
It wasn't originally tested in people that were under 18. And we put them on the market. And now we're basically doing phase 4 studies where having the drug, or in this case, the vaccine approved, we're now trying to learn as we go along what the dangers are. And that's not the way to deal with a vaccine that you're vaccinating, billions of people.
Yeah.
That's just, to me, it's just insane.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at like India, for example, in May and June, they had a huge spike, nothing like they've ever seen before in cases and deaths. They figure at least 400,000 people died in those 2 months. But interestingly, after that, it just plummeted down the death rate. So the last 4 months, there's very few reported cases of COVID-19, never mind deaths. Now, I'm sure that it's still there and it's still going on, but certainly nowhere near the extent. And you have to remember too, when they had those cases of 400,000 people dying in that May and June, the death rate per capita was the same as Ontario. So it's just that their country has like what 1.4 billion people.
Mm.
Now, if you look at what percentage of their population was vaccinated even today, and it's less than 15%. I think the number is closer to 11%.
Mm.
So how did they get this dramatic drop that's been sustainable for at least 4 months in the country where the Delta variant originally came from? Well, natural immunity. And they
Mm.
figure over 70% of their population now has natural immunity. And, when we were talking earlier on in this pandemic, we were saying if we could get 60% immunity, that would do the trick.
Yeah.
Now we're at 90% immunity, and that's just not good enough.
Yeah.
I know we don't have any definition of when does this pandemic end in terms of being in emergency status. Yeah,
it is amazing. With the term shifting the goalposts, I mean, has taken on new meaning because it just seems like every day things get changed and we move it just a little bit further, and we
yeah.
never seem to reach an end point.
No, we're at a situation now where the policies are the most restrictive they've ever been in Canada. And in fact, when you look at where Australia is right now, that seems to be the direction that we're going. And that's pretty frightening. For democracies like Canada and basically Australia, it's nuts. And apparently in Israel, the people that are not triple vaccinated, that those, even though they've been double vaccinated, have lost their status. They're very highly discriminated against.
Mm.
And you hear about some places that if you leave your home, you can get like a $5,000 fine. I mean, it's it's crazy.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
is. So is there anything that you think that we're not talking about that we should be talking about or should be investigating that just has not hit the public consciousness? Anything that you would want people to know about?
Well, I think the key thing here is we have a society, in fact, a planet, that's in a mass psychosis, that's being driven by fear, that's actually making bad decisions, not ones that are really based on science and evidence and balanced. We have no debate, incredible censorship within mainstream media, um, no interest on the part of, let's say, the public health authorities to really debate with other scientists about that, this mainstream narrative idea that the virus, especially the Delta strain, is deadly, that the vaccine is the answer to the question and that this problem, and that the vaccines are completely safe. I mean, that's the narrative. It's very simple, and it's kept pumping out in mainstream media and social media. Giants of basically are heavy censors now too. So when you have a situation where science is not driving decision making and it's really politics driven, and you're having very totalitarian um, decisions that are being made that completely violate the Canadian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. And the justification is that we're in a state of emergency. But when you look at, well, what is this emergency exactly in terms of the impacts on the public from the threat, from the virus itself? This is actually a very, very low threat. So the question is, what's the threshold for government to be able to take actions that curtail public liberties and and basically make it very hard to come up with solutions to these problems that may be much more effective than currently what we're doing, because we have this dogmatic view that this way is the right way and everything else is basically um, radicals that are people that aren't that knowledgeable. And the funny thing is that when you look at the average education level of people who are not getting vaccinated, it's actually very high. It's higher than the general population, as it
Yeah.
turns out. And so, it's not that these people are stupid
No.
that don't want to be vaccinated. In fact, it's that they're doing their homework, they're practicing critical thinking, and they have good reasons to be concerned about being vaccinated, despite the threat that the virus itself holds. And again, everybody is different in terms of their situation, and there may be situations where even these vaccines might make sense. But for vaccinating children, really, there's no good justification for this. And so I'm completely against this, as are a number of pediatricians that I know.
Mm.
So hopefully that information will start coming out more, and we'll start acting a little bit more sensibly in this regard.
Well, my hope is that we can take a more measured response as a country, and that people will start to, sadly, as the impact on the children, I think, as that comes to light, I think sadly that's what will probably be the thing that
Yeah.
really helps to bring reason to this situation, because as you say, it's to this point seemed to be quite unreasoned, and I think any situation where you feel the need to censor your response and censor someone who is um, knowledgeable and learned in an area, I think that speaks to the fact that you're probably not on the right track. And my hope is that through conversations such as the one you and I have had this evening, that we'll hope to reach a wider audience and connect with people and get them thinking about the fact that what they've been told and what they've been led to believe is not necessarily accurate, and that they maybe start to see what's actually going on. So
Well,
I
the
really
other,
appreciate you. Sorry, you're gonna say.
yeah, I was just say one last thing. There are literally hundreds of thousands of people in our country right now that are facing losing their jobs
Mm.
because they don't want to be vaccinated. I've talked to well over 1,000 of those people myself. So I know their stories. I know their anguish. I know they don't understand how could this possibly be happening.
Mm.
And those are just the people I talk to. And that's because, I do this, I've done this testing, and they've expressed, why they wanted to be in our trial. And the thing is that when we're in a situation like this and they're finding that their own family members or friends are ostracizing them, um, there's such a fear and discrimination in an age when we're supposed to be enlightened with equity and diversity and inclusion. It's like we've just created just another medical apartheid situation in our country. And to me, this is just so shocking. For I would think that Canadians are well known to be very tolerant people, but this is just not what's coming across. So it's really testing the fabric of our society. And people that are being subjected to these things or don't think it's right, they really have to become much more vocal, because the politicians listen to the people that make the most noise. And if 10% of people feel strongly this way and they have good reasons, then eventually everybody else will start to recognize what's actually happening and not like it. And then we can get change in a positive direction, not in the course that we're currently going. And we have to be guided really by the winds of truth. And I would like to say that for me and many of my colleagues, that's what's in our sails. We know that whatever abuses that we might experience and losses that we might come, for some of them, they've lost their jobs.
Mm.
At the end of the day, we know that the truth will prevail, and we are very, very careful to make sure that we're on the right track as scientists and medical doctors and other practitioners, that we're on the right side of this. So I think in the end, science does prevail, but unfortunately, it takes a while before it gets into the public, you know, collective consciousness. And so this is where I think in time we'll see this house of cards fall, and hopefully we'll have something better to replace it.
Yeah, eloquently said. Dr. Pelech, is there anything you would want to would you like to talk about the name of the company and the website, just so that people wanted to reach out and find out more information about the
Well, it's a tricky thing. We're so overwhelmed right
Yeah, I
now
know.
with people that wanted to join our trial,
Yeah.
and we're a small company. We're trying to maybe even think about spinning out another company that's focused on this, so that maybe we can be even better prepared for the next virus or bacterial threat. And also, we're interested in developing technologies where, and this is what my company was really working on, was the ability to use antibodies as probes in microarrays, where we can do on a glass slide uh, thousands of tests to determine, for example, if a person was looking into their bloodstream, we took a drop of blood, could we in fact track in the serum of their blood proteins that are being released from different organs in the body or cancer cells that would let us know that there's actually damage in those locations from chronic disease or from a trauma or something, so that it would be a very early warning system that that individual has a medical underlying problem before it actually presents itself, in terms of being sick. Because we know that the earlier that you can diagnose a problem, the more likely that you can treat it. So these are all kind of directions I like to take our research, and really focus on looking at serum samples. So this is one out, I guess, an offspring of the kind of research that we've been doing. But I can't do it within the context of my existing company. We just don't have the capacity. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time, and really appreciate it. And I'm hoping that maybe at some point we could catch up again, and hopefully during happier times. But I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode.
Please note that neither the host nor the guest have any undeclared conflicts of interest. Please visit novametricsinc.com for more information about the Canadian COVID collaboration.